Yesterday, the Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Commissioner tabled her inaugural report to Parliament designed to measure progress and impact of the national plan to end violence against women and children. The Commissioner warned that the women's safety sector is already buckling under huge pressure and that when there's an increase in reporting, frontline services need more support to meet increased demand. We have an epidemic of men's violence against women, and our frontline services are doing the very best they can in a system that continues to tell them to do more with less. For the national plan to end violence against women and children to succeed, it needs to be properly funded. Because we need to be clear here, the true cost of not funding this plan will be women's safety, their lives and their children's lives. The women's safety sector has said that for a decade, and they've said this for a decade, that they need $1 billion each year to be able to help everyone who reaches out for help, rather than having to turn people away back to situations of violence. Labor has so far only committed less than 2/3 of this amount. I just want the government to recognise the horror that this poor system is actually inflicting, not only on those making the brave decision to flee violence, but on the staff who've dedicated their lives to helping the most vulnerable. It's traumatising, and it could be avoided if Labor provided the funds required for the national plan to actually succeed. If Labor continues to ignore the calls for more funding, they risk squandering another decade and more women's lives. Already this year, just this year, devastatingly, 45 women have been killed by violence. 45. We know this number because of the brave work of volunteer organisation Counting Dead Women Australia and their research through Destroy the Joint. The government doesn't even keep a national family and domestic violence death toll. The Greens have been pushing for years for the government to keep an FDV death toll. We need this important data to aid in awareness raising and prevention, and yet this work is done by volunteers. How many more women have to die for the government to actually do something useful about it? What's the price that women have to pay? For many, sadly, it's the ultimate price. Here's another cruel fact. First Nations women are 33 times more likely to be hospitalised as a result of violence and 6 times more likely to be killed. Yet we know that First Nations women are over-policed and under-supported. Our so-called justice system are weaponised against them. They experience systemic racism, victim blaming and very poor police responses. This government needs to do better for our First Nations women and children. We also know that women on low wages or income support are especially vulnerable without the resources to escape violent situations. Yet this government persists with the cruelty of keeping income support payments like JobSeeker below the poverty line and has the audacity to cry poor while dishing out hundreds of billions of dollars in tax cuts and handouts for the rich. And the housing crisis is felt even more acutely by women and children experiencing family and domestic violence. Women are forced to choose between abuse or homelessness because there's just nowhere for them to go. Let's be clear, our social security system is built on shame and humiliation, demonising those who need these supports. It's absolutely a further barrier for people escaping violence. And the government could have solved this. They could have solved this if they'd worked with the Greens on their housing plans. We can scrap negative gearing and capital gains tax handouts, build more houses and put a freeze and a cap on rents to make housing affordable so people don't have to choose between abuse and homelessness. And the money they make from scrapping tax handouts to wealthy property developers, they could invest that directly, Deputy Speaker, into crisis accommodation or funding the absolutely critical services our frontline workers provide to people escaping violence. But while the Labor government continues to underfund frontline family, domestic and sexual violence services, victim survivors are turned away from crisis accommodation and one woman is murdered every 4 days in this country. This issue should be above politics, and we've heard some very fine and heartfelt words from the speakers here today. It is well past time the Albanese government fully funded the organisations that actually do the hard work on the front line of this dreadful epidemic. Anything less is a betrayal to women, and the more Labor ignores this crisis, the more women will die.
Authorised by E. Watson Brown, Australian Greens, Taringa.